Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. We're about to explore the fascinating world of expenditure multipliers. The module is titled Expenditure Multipliers, and it focuses on how a single dollar of spending can ripple through an economy and multiply into much greater growth. We'll look at the core concept in macroeconomics that explains this powerful phenomenon. Throughout this session, we'll understand how spending drives economic activity and why it's so important in understanding economic growth. So, let's get started and dive into the power of spending and the idea behind expenditure multipliers. Before we dive into how the multiplier works, it's important to understand what happens in the economy when prices stay fixed. So, let's focus on this idea of fixed prices and real GDP. Think of this as the foundation of our discussion. When prices don't change, it allows us to see more clearly how the economy responds to changes in spending and output. This is crucial because it helps us isolate the effects of demand without the complication of rising or falling prices. By understanding this baseline, we can better grasp the broader concepts of economic fluctuations and the multiplier effect later on. Essentially, this slide sets the stage for understanding how real GDP behaves when prices are stable, which is key to grasping the overall picture. Sticky prices are a real-world phenomenon that we actually observe in many economies. This assumption, that prices don't change immediately, is the starting point for Keynesian short-run analysis. It helps us understand how the economy behaves over a shorter period. By assuming a fixed price level, we simplify our model, which allows us to focus on how changes in spending directly impact real output and GDP. This way, we can ignore the noise of inflation for now. In the short run, especially during recessions or economic downturns, prices tend to be sticky. Wages, contracts, and menu prices don't adjust instantly to changes in economic conditions. This stickiness is a key reason why we see fluctuations in output and employment even when the overall price level remains relatively stable in the short term. When prices stand still, it means that the economy's response to shifts in demand or spending can be more immediate and pronounced. This is a crucial assumption in Keynesian models because it helps us understand why fiscal policy can have a direct and significant impact on real GDP during these periods. So, in essence, the idea of sticky prices allows us to analyze short-term economic fluctuations more effectively, highlighting the importance of demand and spending in driving economic activity when prices aren't instantly flexible. So let's talk about the equilibrium condition in the economy. Essentially, the economy reaches equilibrium when aggregate expenditure, or I, equals real GDP. In other words, planned spending matches the actual output produced. When this balance occurs, the economy is in a stable state. Now, a key component of this is net exports, which is the value of exports minus imports. This represents the foreign sector's contribution to domestic demand, so how much other countries are buying from us minus what we're purchasing from them. Next, we have public expenditure, which includes government spending on goods, services, and infrastructure projects. This is often referred to simply as government G, and it plays a vital role in influencing overall demand. Then there's investment, labeled as I, which covers business spending on capital, things like equipment, structures, and inventories. This kind of spending is crucial because it helps expand productive capacity and supports future growth. Finally, household consumption, or C, is the largest component of aggregate expenditure. It includes all the goods and services that households buy. Since it's the biggest part, changes here tend to have a significant impact on overall economic activity. Now, with prices held fixed, the level of real GDP is determined entirely by planned spending, what we call aggregate expenditure, or I. So, in this simplified view, if planned spending increases, real GDP tends to increase as well, and vice versa. This concept is fundamental because it shows us that, under stable prices, the economy's output is driven by how much households, businesses, and the government intend to spend. It's a straightforward way to understand what determines overall economic activity in the short run. Now, let's take a closer look at this graph. The 45-degree line represents a key concept. It's where planned spending exactly equals real output, or GDP. When we are above this line, it means that spending is higher than what the economy is actually producing. In this situation, inventories tend to fall because firms are selling more than they are producing, prompting them to expand their output. Conversely, when we are below the line, output exceeds spending. This causes inventories to pile up since goods are produced but not sold, leading firms to contract their production. The point where the I line intersects the 45-degree line is crucial. That's where the economy is in balance, or in equilibrium. At this intersection, planned spending perfectly matches actual output, and there's no tendency for inventories to change. Understanding this balance point helps us see how shifts in spending or output can push the economy away from or toward equilibrium. Now, let's take a closer look at the concept of the expenditure multiplier and how it creates what we call the ripple effect. This idea is central to understanding how changes in spending can have a much larger impact on the economy than initially expected. When one person or entity spends money, that spending doesn't just stay isolated. It sets off a chain reaction. For example, if the government invests in infrastructure, that money goes to construction companies, which then pay their workers. Those workers, in turn, spend their earnings on goods and services, and the cycle continues. This chain reaction amplifies the initial expenditure, leading to a greater overall effect on economic activity. Recognizing this ripple effect helps us understand the power of fiscal policy and how strategic spending can stimulate growth more broadly. It's a key piece of the puzzle in explaining how our economy responds to various shocks and policies. This initial $100 billion is really just the starting point. What makes this so powerful is the multiplier effect, which means that the impact will grow as the money circulates through the entire economy. When the government injects this money into the system, it kicks off a chain reaction of economic activity that's much larger than the original amount. Think of it like dropping a stone into a pond. The ripple effect spreads outward. For example, imagine the government announces a $100 billion investment in infrastructure, building new highways, bridges, and public transit systems. This spending not only creates jobs immediately, but also stimulates demand for materials, labor, and services. This process, which we call an injection of spending, is often referred to as the initial spark. It's the starting point that ignites broader economic activity. So, in essence, this initial investment sets off a cycle of income and expenditure that amplifies the original outlay, fueling economic growth. Understanding this is key to seeing how government spending can be a powerful tool to stimulate the economy, especially during times of slowdown or recession. It's about creating momentum that goes far beyond the initial dollar amount. Once the initial investment is made, each of these recipients will start to spend a portion of their new income, which triggers the next round of economic activity. For example, steel, cement, and equipment suppliers will generate revenue from the projects, and that revenue becomes income for their employees. These material suppliers play a crucial role in fueling the cycle. Meanwhile, technical professionals like engineers and designers will receive salaries and fees, adding to household income across the economy. Their work ensures that the projects are planned and executed efficiently. Laborers involved in building roads, bridges, and transit systems will earn wages. And importantly, they tend to spend that income locally, further circulating money within the community. And let's not forget the government's $100 billion investment. It flows directly into the pockets of workers and businesses involved in construction, creating immediate economic impact. This first round of spending is fundamental because it sets off a chain reaction, amplifying the economic benefits of the original investment. Let's talk about the marginal propensity to save, which is represented by that 20 cents saved from each dollar earned. This concept is paired with the marginal propensity to spend, or MPS, and together they always add up to 1. So, if MPS is 0.8, then MPC, or the marginal propensity to consume, is 0.8 as well. What this means in real terms is that for every new dollar a household earns, about 80 cents are spent on goods and services. That leaves roughly 20 cents saved. Now, the key point here is that the higher the MPC, the stronger the multiplier effect becomes. In other words, when households tend to spend more of each additional dollar they earn, this spending circulates through the economy more vigorously, amplifying economic activity. So, the MPC essentially measures how much of each extra dollar a household chooses to spend versus save. It's a crucial concept because it helps us understand how changes in income influence overall consumption and, ultimately, economic growth. This slide is all about how a geometric series works in the context of spending and income. Essentially, it converges to a finite sum, which we can determine using the expenditure multiplier formula. What's interesting here is that each round of spending gets smaller, shrinks, but the total amount that accumulates actually grows with every iteration. Think of it like a chain reaction. For example, in the next wave of earners, we see $64 billion spent. Then, in the following round, income recipients spend about $80 billion, assuming a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8. Before that, the government injected $100 billion into infrastructure in the first round. And here's the key point. Each round of spending becomes income for the next group. That next group then spends their own fraction, which continues the cycle. Over time, this process adds up to far more than the original investment, making the total impact much larger. This chain reaction demonstrates how initial spending can trigger a ripple effect, leading to a multiplied economic impact that's much greater than the initial injection. It's a fundamental concept in understanding fiscal policy and economic growth. Now, let's look at the big picture of how the initial injection of $100 billion ripples through the economy. Starting with that initial injection, which is our $100 billion, we see how spending from the first wave of earners then spreads out. This initial spending, in turn, generates a series of rounds of economic activity. In the second round, we see about $80 billion spent by those first wave earners, which then gets passed on to the next group. Moving to the third round, the total impact grows to around $64 billion, as this money continues to circulate and generate further economic activity. And when we sum up all these rounds, the initial injection plus each subsequent round, we reach a total GDP impact of around $500 billion. This amplified sum shows how a relatively small initial investment can lead to a much larger overall effect when it circulates through different parts of the economy. It's a powerful illustration of the multiplier effect, how initial spending can really magnify the economic impact over multiple cycles. Now, let's move from the theoretical formula to understanding its real-world impact by looking at how we calculate the multiplier effect. This is a crucial step because it helps us quantify the broader economic influence that a single investment or spending can generate. The multiplier effect essentially shows us that every dollar spent doesn't just stay in one place. It circulates through the economy, creating additional economic activity along the way. By calculating this effect, we can better understand the true value of investments, projects, or policies, and see how they contribute to overall economic growth. So, when we talk about calculating the multiplier effect, we're looking at the chain reaction of spending, income, and further investment that amplifies the initial input. This process helps us connect the dots from a simple formula to the tangible, impactful changes in the economy, reinforcing the significance of strategic investments and policy decisions. Let's look at how the multiplier works with different MPC values. When the MPC is 0.5, the multiplier is calculated as 1 divided by 1 minus 0.5, which equals 1 divided by 0.5, giving us a multiplier of 2. This means that an initial dollar of spending can generate a total of $2 in economic activity. Now, if the MPC increases to 0.75, the calculation becomes 1 divided by 1 minus 0.75, which is 1 divided by 0.25, resulting in a multiplier of 4. So, with a higher MPC, the total impact of initial spending is larger. And if the MPC is 0.8, the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus 0.8, which equals 1 divided by 0.2, giving us a multiplier of 5. Again, a higher MPC means even more total economic impact from the same initial expenditure. So, the key takeaway here is that a higher MPC leads to a larger multiplier, amplifying the overall effect of initial spending on the economy. The general formula for the multiplier is 1 divided by 1 minus MPC. This multiplier, essentially, translates an initial injection of spending into the total change in real GDP. It's derived from the idea of an infinite geometric series of spending rounds, where each round adds to the total impact based on the MPC. And that's why understanding the multiplier helps us see how initial spending can have a magnified effect on the economy. This slide explains why fiscal policy can be such a powerful tool. When the government makes a targeted injection of spending, it can actually stimulate activity many times over the initial amount, if the marginal propensity to consume, or MPC, is high enough. Here, we're looking at a scenario where a $100 billion investment in infrastructure leads to a total increase in real GDP of $500 billion. That's a 5-fold increase, and the key factor here is the multiplier effect. With an MPC of 0.8, which means people tend to spend 80% of any additional income they receive, the multiplier is quite high, specifically 5. So, $1 of initial spending results in $5 of total impact on the economy. This is a clear demonstration of how a relatively small initial outlay, $100 billion, can produce a much larger overall boost, $500 billion, in economic activity. It underscores how powerful fiscal policy can be, especially when the conditions are right, and highlights the importance of understanding the multiplier effect in economic planning. Let's take a closer look at this slide. The key idea here is the concept of an infinite geometric series, which in this context relates to how spending impacts the economy. When we talk about the sum of an infinite series with a ratio of MPC, or marginal propensity to consume, it converges to this formula: initial spending multiplied by 1 over 1 minus MPC. Essentially, this shows how each dollar spent triggers additional rounds of spending, amplifying the total impact. Now, look at the final bar on the chart. It's labeled $500 billion in total GDP impact. Notice that this is 5 times larger than the initial $100 billion government outlay. This 5-fold increase perfectly reflects the multiplier effect of 5, which we've been discussing throughout the presentation. The chart illustrates something important. Each successive round of spending gets smaller, but even though they diminish, the cumulative total becomes huge compared to the initial injection. It's like a snowball rolling downhill. It keeps growing as it picks up momentum. Finally, when you see the numbers 500, 51, 64, 80, and 100, they show how the impact diminishes with each round, but the total keeps adding up. Visualizing this amplification helps us understand why fiscal policy, like government spending, can have such a powerful effect on the economy. Let's explore how we move from aggregate expenditure, or I, to the overall demand in the economy. When we talk about I, we're looking at the total spending by households, businesses, government, and net exports. This spending directly influences the demand for goods and services. Think of I as the foundation. It's what drives the demand curve. As spending increases, the quantity of goods and services demanded also rises, shifting the curve accordingly. Conversely, if spending decreases, demand drops. Connecting expenditure to demand helps us understand the broader picture of economic activity. It shows us that changes in how much people and entities spend can significantly impact the overall demand in the economy. This connection is crucial because it links the micro-level decisions, like a household choosing to buy more or less, to macroeconomic outcomes, such as shifts in the aggregate demand curve. So, in essence, the aggregate expenditure is a key component that helps explain the movements we see in the economy's demand, tying individual spending behavior to the bigger economic picture. So the key insight here is that the aggregate expenditure, or I model, at a fixed price level, represents just one point on the aggregate demand curve. When we change the price level, we actually move to a new I equilibrium, which corresponds to another point on the AD curve. Think of it this way. The AD curve is downward sloping, and it's plotted against the price level. It shows us how demand in the economy varies as the overall price level changes. Now, aggregate demand is a broader concept. It captures how the total demand for goods and services, by households, firms, and governments, fluctuates at different price levels across the entire economy. On the other hand, aggregate expenditure, or I, is a short-run concept. It helps us find the equilibrium level of real GDP when prices are held constant. Essentially, I is the total planned spending on goods and services at a specific fixed price level. To sum up, while I is about planned spending at a fixed price, AD shows us how demand shifts as prices change throughout the economy. The two are closely related but serve different purposes. I helps us analyze short-term equilibrium, and AD provides the broader picture of demand across different price levels. Now, what we're seeing here is that the rightward shift in aggregate demand, or AD, is actually larger than the initial increase in autonomous spending. And the reason for that is the multiplier effect. Essentially, more spending at a fixed price level leads to a greater overall demand at every price point. This is where the multiplier really comes into play, expanding the impact of that initial spending boost. So, when autonomous spending, like government expenditures or business investments that don't depend on income, rises, it causes the aggregate expenditure, or I, curve to shift upward. And because of the multiplier, this upward shift in I results in a much larger rightward shift in the AD curve. It's like a ripple effect. A small initial change in autonomous spending can lead to a much bigger change in overall demand. To connect the dots, shifting the I curve upward directly causes the AD curve to shift rightward. This highlights how autonomous spending increases can significantly influence the broader economy through these multiplier effects. So what we're seeing here is that when the output level increases, it does so at every price point, which means the entire aggregate demand curve shifts to the right. This shift reflects an overall increase in demand across the economy. As a result, the equilibrium real GDP rises, and this increase is multiplied by the multiplier effect based on the initial injection of spending. Now, on the aggregate expenditure curve, or I curve, we observe an upward shift. This shift occurs when government spending or investment increases independently of the current income levels, meaning these are autonomous changes. When autonomous spending goes up, it causes the I curve to shift up as well. And because of the multiplier effect, this upward shift in the I curve actually leads to a proportionally larger rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. In other words, more autonomous spending results in greater overall demand at every price level. So the key takeaway here is that more spending, whether by the government or through investment, leads to greater demand across the economy, and this effect is amplified through the multiplier. This is how increased autonomous spending can significantly boost overall economic activity and help stimulate growth. In conclusion, the expenditure model really serves as a bridge between short-term planning and the broader aggregate demand framework. It helps us connect classroom theory to real-world policy decisions. When we look at how aggregate expenditure meets aggregate demand, we see how policymakers use the multiplier effect to calibrate fiscal stimulus. For example, A $100 billion investment can potentially lead to a $500 billion impact on GDP. But of course, this depends on certain conditions being right. This is where the multiplier acts as a powerful policy tool. It shows us that a single dollar of government spending can generate more than $1 in GDP growth. Every dollar injected into the economy doesn't just stay there. It echoes through the entire economic system, amplifying the overall impact. So, to wrap up, the key takeaway is the multiplier's incredible power to amplify fiscal policy effects. It's a vital concept that links theory with practical policy, helping us understand how strategic spending can significantly influence economic growth.